Imagine waking up one morning with a fever. By afternoon, dark swellings appear under your arms. By evening, you're coughing blood. Within 3 days, you're dead. And so is half your neighborhood. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for millions of Europeans in the 14th century. Between 1347 and 1353, a pestilence so devastating swept across Europe that it killed roughly 1/3 of the entire population. Some regions lost up to 60% of their people. We're talking about 25 million deaths in just 6 years. But here's what most people don't know. This apocalyptic plague didn't just kill millions. It completely shattered the medieval world and rebuilt it from scratch. The Black Death didn't just change Europe, it created the Europe we know today. This is the story of how humanity's darkest hour became the unexpected catalyst for the modern world. October 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships dock at the Sicilian port of Messina after a long journey from the Crimean Peninsula. The sailors stumble off the vessels, covered in mysterious black boils, feverish, and many already dead or dying. The harbor officials are horrified. They order the death ships to leave immediately, but it's already too late. The invisible killer has made landfall. Within days, people in Messina start developing the same terrifying symptoms. Dark, apple-sized swellings, called buboes, erupt in the groin, neck, and armpits. Victims develop fevers that spike to unbearable levels. They vomit blood. Their skin develops dark blotches, hence the name Black Death. The smell of rotting flesh emanates from the living. And then, within 2 to 7 days of the first symptoms, most victims die in agony. What made this disease so terrifying wasn't just its lethality, it was its speed and indiscriminate nature. Rich or poor, young or old, priest or peasant, nobody was safe. The plague didn't care about your social status, your piety, or your wealth. Medieval Europeans called it the Great Mortality or the Pestilence. The term Black Death wouldn't become popular until centuries later, but the name perfectly captures the horror of watching black, necrotic tissue spread across victims' bodies as their organs shut down. By January 1348, the plague had spread to mainland Italy. By summer, it reached France and Spain. By autumn, it arrived in England. Within 3 years, it had consumed virtually all of Europe, from Sicily to Scotland, from Portugal to Poland. Let me put this in perspective for modern audiences. Imagine if a disease emerged today that killed 100 million Americans in 3 years. That's the proportional impact the Black Death had on medieval Europe. Cities became mass graves. In Florence, Italy, the famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the devastation firsthand. He wrote, "The victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. People were literally healthy at breakfast and dead by sunset." But here's where it gets even more disturbing: nobody knew what was causing it. Imagine facing an invisible enemy that kills with ruthless efficiency, and you have absolutely no idea what it is, where it comes from, or how to stop it. Medieval Europeans were intelligent, resourceful people, but they were working with a medieval understanding of disease that was fundamentally wrong. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand germ theory. Microscopes wouldn't be invented for another 300 years. So what did they blame? The medical faculty of Paris, the most prestigious medical institution in Europe, issued an official report in 1348. Their conclusion? An unfortunate alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had corrupted the air itself. This miasma, poisonous air, was entering people's bodies and killing them. Their prescribed treatments: breathe in sweet-smelling herbs. Avoid baths because they open your pores to the bad air. Balance your bodily humors through bloodletting. Every single one of these cures was either useless or actively harmful. Doctors wore those iconic beaked masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, believing the fragrant air would protect them. It didn't. Many doctors died just as quickly as their patients. Some communities tried more desperate measures. They would seal infected families inside their homes, boarding up the doors and windows, leaving entire households to die together. The logic was containment, but the cruelty was absolute. Others turned to religious explanations. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Across Europe, groups of flagellants roamed from town to town, publicly whipping themselves bloody, hoping their suffering would appease God's wrath. But when prayer didn't work, when medicine failed, when nothing seemed to stop the dying, people looked for scapegoats. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague deliberately. This horrific conspiracy theory led to some of the worst pogroms in medieval history. In Strasbourg alone, 2,000 Jews were burned alive. In Basel, the entire Jewish population was locked in a wooden building and set on fire. The irony? Jewish communities often had lower plague mortality rates because Jewish law required regular hand-washing and had strict cleanliness standards. But instead of learning from this, the lower death rates were taken as proof of guilt. The reality that medieval Europeans couldn't see was this: the Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on black rats. These rats thrived in medieval cities with poor sanitation, living in close quarters with humans. When an infected flea bit a person, the bacteria entered the bloodstream and began reproducing at catastrophic speed. Medieval cities were perfect breeding grounds. Narrow, crowded streets. No sewage systems. Waste thrown into the streets. Rats everywhere. Once the plague arrived, it spread like wildfire. But medieval people couldn't see microscopic bacteria or understand disease vectors. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't comprehend with weapons that didn't work. By 1353, the first wave of the Black Death had finally burned itself out, not because humanity defeated it, but simply because it had killed so many people that there weren't enough hosts left to sustain its spread. The survivors emerged into a completely transformed world. When the plague finally receded, Europe was unrecognizable. Entire villages stood empty, fields went unplowed. Cathedrals sat half-built, their construction crews dead. An estimated 25 million people had died, roughly 1 out of every 3 Europeans. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of all this death. The medieval social order, which had been rigid and unchanging for centuries, suddenly shattered. Let me explain why this matters. Before the Black Death, European society was built on feudalism. At the bottom were peasants, the vast majority of the population, who worked the land they didn't own. Above them were nobles who owned the land. At the top were kings and the church. Peasants were essentially tied to the land. They couldn't leave, they couldn't choose their work. They owed labor, crops, and taxes to their lords. Social mobility was virtually impossible. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. Your children would be peasants. Your grandchildren would be peasants. This system had been in place for over 500 years. It seemed eternal and unchangeable. Then the plague killed 1/3 of the workforce practically overnight. And suddenly, for the first time in centuries, ordinary workers had leverage. Think about basic economics. When labor is abundant and land is scarce, workers have no bargaining power. But when workers are scarce and land is abundant, everything changes. Surviving peasants looked around and saw empty fields everywhere. They realized that lords desperately needed workers. And for the first time, they could make demands. Pay me more, or I'll work for someone else. Reduce my rents, or I'll move to the next village. Give me better conditions, or go farm your own land. The old feudal ties were breaking down. Peasants abandoned their traditional manners and moved to wherever they could get the best deal. Lords who refused to pay higher wages watched their fields go fallow while workers went elsewhere. Wages skyrocketed. In England, agricultural wages increased by 50 to 100% in the decades after the plague. Workers who had previously subsisted on the edge of starvation suddenly could afford meat, ale, and even luxury goods occasionally. The nobility was horrified. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourse in 1351, attempting to cap wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from changing employers. France passed similar laws. These laws were massively unpopular and almost impossible to enforce. Workers simply ignored them, and lords who wanted their fields worked had no choice but to pay market rates. The psychological shift was just as important as the economic one. Peasants who had previously accepted their position as divinely ordained now questioned everything. If God had killed the nobility at the same rate as peasants, maybe the social hierarchy wasn't so sacred after all. This growing consciousness led to major uprisings. In 1358, French peasants launched the Jacquerie Rebellion. In 1381, English peasants marched on London in the famous Peasants' Revolt, demanding an end to serfdom. These rebellions were ultimately crushed, but they sent a clear message: the old order was dying, and common people would no longer accept their subjugation without question. The church's authority suffered too. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the unquestioned moral and spiritual authority in Europe. Priests claimed special access to God. The church promised that prayer, penance, and obedience would bring salvation. But during the plague, priests died just like everyone else, often at higher rates because they administered last rites to the dying. Churches couldn't protect anyone. Prayers went unanswered. Mass pilgrimages accomplished nothing except spreading the disease further. Many survivors began questioning church teachings. If God was truly protecting the faithful, why did devout Christians die while some sinners survived? Why did the church have no answers? Monasteries, which had been major landowners and employers, were particularly hard hit. Some lost 50 to 80% of their monks. Their economic power declined significantly, the church's land holdings decreased, and with it, their political influence. This crisis of faith wouldn't fully manifest for another 150 years, but the seeds of the Protestant Reformation were planted in the plague years. Once people started questioning religious authority, that skepticism never fully disappeared. Now here's the paradox that makes the Black Death one of history's most important turning points. This catastrophic tragedy directly enabled the Renaissance, one of humanity's greatest cultural flowerings. How does the worst disaster in European history lead to an explosion of art, science, and human achievement? The answer lies in a combination of wealth concentration, social mobility, and psychological transformation. First, the economic factor. With 1/3 of the population dead but the total amount of wealth largely unchanged, the survivors were significantly richer on average. Inherited wealth was concentrated in fewer hands. Workers earned higher wages. Middle-class merchants and craftsmen found new opportunities. This meant more disposable income for things beyond bare survival. People could afford books, art, education, and leisure. The market for cultural goods exploded. In Italy, wealthy merchant families like the Medici in Florence became patrons of artists and scholars. They commissioned paintings, sculptures, and buildings not just for religious purposes but for personal prestige and aesthetic appreciation. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael flourished in this environment. They didn't have to depend solely on church commissions. Wealthy individuals and city-states competed to sponsor their work. Second, the social mobility we discussed earlier meant talented individuals from lower classes could now rise based on merit. Before the plague, if you were born a peasant, it didn't matter how brilliant you were, you'd die plowing a field. After the plague, clever individuals could become merchants, skilled craftsmen, scholars, or artists. This meant Europe was finally tapping into the intellectual potential of its entire population, not just the tiny aristocratic class. Universities expanded. Literacy increased. The printing press, invented around 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg, democratized knowledge in a way that would have been economically impossible in the pre-plague world. But perhaps most importantly, the Black Death fundamentally changed how Europeans thought about life, death, and human existence. When you've watched half your community die in agony, when you've seen that wealth and piety offer no protection, when you've witnessed the apparent randomness of death, you start thinking differently about what matters. Medieval philosophy had emphasized the afterlife. Life on earth was just preparation for eternity. Suffering was good because it brought you closer to God. Individual happiness was irrelevant. Post-plague Europeans became more present-focused. If death could come at any moment, maybe you should enjoy life while you have it. If we can't understand God's plan, maybe we should focus on understanding the natural world. This shift gave birth to humanism, a philosophy that emphasized human dignity, individual potential, and earthly achievement. Humanist scholars studied classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, rediscovering philosophies that celebrated human reason and accomplishment. The Renaissance wasn't just about pretty paintings. It represented a fundamental reorientation of European thought toward the individual, toward empirical observation, toward human potential. This new mindset directly enabled the scientific revolution. Post-plague Europeans were more willing to question authority, to experiment, to observe nature directly rather than simply accepting ancient texts. When Andreas Vesalius dissected human corpses in the 1540s to understand anatomy, something previously forbidden, he was building on a post-plague willingness to challenge tradition in pursuit of knowledge. The plague also accelerated medical progress, ironically. Doctors who had failed so completely during the Black Death became more experimental, more willing to try new approaches. The concept of quarantine, isolating the sick to prevent disease spread, emerged from plague management and became a foundation of public health. The Black Death didn't just reshape economics and culture, it fundamentally altered European politics and laid the groundwork for the modern nation-state. Here's how. Before the plague, Europe was a patchwork of feudal territories. Real power was local. Kings theoretically ruled kingdoms, but in practice, local nobles controlled their own lands with their own armies. Centralized government barely existed. The feudal military system depended on knights, heavily armored cavalry provided by nobles who held land from the king. This system required a large peasant population to work the land that funded the knights' expensive equipment and training. After the plague killed so many peasants, this system became economically unsustainable. Lords couldn't afford to maintain as many knights. The traditional feudal army was dying, but Europe's wars didn't stop. So how did kingdoms fight? They hired professional soldiers, mercenaries, standing armies paid in cash rather than supported by land grants. This change was revolutionary. Professional armies were loyal to whoever paid them, which meant the king, not to local lords, not to feudal territories, to the central authority with enough tax revenue to pay wages. This shift dramatically increased royal power at the expense of the nobility. Kings who could raise taxes and maintain standing armies could enforce their will across their kingdoms in ways medieval monarchs never could. Look at France. Before the Black Death, French kings had limited control outside their immediate territory around Paris. By 1500, after implementing new taxation systems and building a professional army, French monarchs had centralized power and could truly be called rulers of France, not just the leading noble among many. England followed a similar pattern. So did Spain after the unification under Ferdinand and Isabella. These emerging nation-states needed bureaucracies to collect taxes, administer justice, and manage territories. This created opportunities for educated commoners to enter government service. Social mobility increased further. The new bureaucratic class, neither noble nor peasant, would eventually become what we call the middle class. And the middle class would drive modernization for the next 5 centuries. The plague also accelerated the decline of feudalism by making money more important than land. Before the plague, wealth meant land ownership. After the plague, with labor so scarce, wealth increasingly meant cash to pay workers. This monetization of the economy favored merchants and bankers over traditional landed aristocrats. Cities grew in importance relative to rural manors. Banking families like the Medici gained political power that rivaled ancient noble houses. European exploration and colonialism also have roots in the post-plague world. With labor scarce in Europe, finding new trade routes and resources became more valuable. The Portuguese and Spanish voyages of exploration in the 1400s were partly driven by post-plague economic reorganization. When Columbus sailed in 1492, he was funded by a centralized Spanish monarchy that could never have existed in pre-plague feudal Europe. He was searching for trade routes to replace those disrupted by, ironically, plague outbreaks in Asia. The modern European colonial empires that would come to dominate the world for the next 4 centuries were built on political structures that emerged from the post-plague transformation. Here's something most people don't realize. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 wasn't a one-time event. The plague became endemic in Europe for the next 400 years. The bacterium Yersinia pestis established itself in rodent populations across the continent. Outbreaks recurred every generation. London suffered major plague epidemics in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, 1636, and most famously in 1665, the Great Plague of London that killed 100,000 people. Italy, France, and other regions experienced similar cycles. Each outbreak killed thousands or tens of thousands, though never again at the scale of the initial pandemic. These recurring plagues maintained the social and economic changes we've discussed. Labor remained relatively scarce. Wages stayed higher than pre- or 1347 levels. The old feudal system couldn't fully reconstitute itself, but Europeans gradually learned to manage the plague better. Venice pioneered the concept of quarantine in 1377, requiring ships from infected ports to sit at anchor for 40 days before unloading. Other cities adopted similar measures. Public health boards were established to coordinate responses to outbreaks. Bodies were buried in mass graves outside city walls rather than in churchyards. Infected houses were marked and sealed. These measures weren't perfect, but they reduced mortality. The recurring plague also drove medical progress. Each outbreak brought new observations, new theories, new attempts at treatment. While Europeans still didn't understand the bacterial cause until the 1890s, they were slowly piecing together effective public health responses through trial and error. The plague finally disappeared from Europe in the early 1700s. The last major outbreak was in Marseille in 1720. After that, Yersinia pestis vanished from the continent almost as mysteriously as it had arrived. Why? Historians still debate this. Possible factors include better quarantine practices, improvements in urban sanitation, changes in rat populations, brown rats replacing black rats, ships built differently so rats couldn't nest as easily, Climate changes affecting flea populations. Humans developing some resistance. Likely it was a combination of all these factors. But whatever the cause, by the mid-1700s, Europe was finally plague-free for the first time in 4 centuries. And the Europe that emerged was fundamentally modern. The medieval world was gone forever. Think about what survived from the post-plague transformation. Weakened feudalism replaced by more centralized nation-states. A substantial middle class with economic and political power. Universities and widespread literacy. Scientific inquiry based on observation rather than ancient authority. Humanist philosophy emphasizing individual worth and potential. Professional bureaucracies and armies. Market-based economies with wage labor. These are the foundations of the modern world. The Black Death didn't create all of these changes instantly, but it shattered the old structures so thoroughly that rebuilding meant building something new. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, each of these built on transformations that began in the plague years. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe, but it couldn't kill human resilience, creativity, or the determination to build a better world. If you found this deep dive into history fascinating, please hit that like button. It helps more people discover these stories. Drop a comment below. What aspect of the Black Death's impact surprised you most? The economic transformation? The cultural renaissance? The political changes?